A white gown had hung in Iselin Kaltves's closet for weeks, and yet, on the morning of her wedding, she still felt as though she were putting on a sentence rather than a dream. She had never been the pretty daughter, never the one suitors fought over. She was the one eyes avoided, the one whispers marked the moment she walked into a room. And still, by some cruel twist of fate, it was her, not her flawless sisters, chosen by her own father to seal a marriage no one had bothered to explain. No one said why the rush. There were only hurried glances exchanged between counselors, and a constant sense that something larger was hiding behind that sudden wedding. She looked at the young man waiting for her at the end of the aisle, a stranger, impossibly handsome, and didn't know yet whether she should fear him, thank him, or simply survive the day beside him. He, for his part, felt his stomach twist in a way he couldn't quite name. It wasn't disgust. It was fear. The cowardly fear of being about to spend his life beside a stranger chosen by others, with his own will counting for nothing anymore. Neither of them imagined, in that first tense look, that the true trial of the marriage hadn't even begun yet. Because on their wedding night, when the bedroom doors finally closed and the two of them were left alone, something would happen that would change everything they thought they knew about each other. If you love intense wolf stories with destiny and twists, go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now. So subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any chapters. And how about we get to know each other better? I'm Maggie Reed, the author of these stories, and you? Drop a comment below with your name and what city you're watching from. Iselin Kaltves had been miscounting the same column of coins for 10 minutes. Not because she couldn't add, but because the palace ledger room had become, these past few months, the one place in the castle where nobody measured the distance between her eyes before deciding whether she was worth smiling at. "You're adding the wrong column again," said Fennec, the old royal accountant, without looking up from his own parchment. "I'm thinking, you're hiding." She was ready to fire back. She always had a comeback loaded, the kind of shield she'd been forging since childhood, when the bells of the great hall began to ring. Low, insistent, the kind of sound that made even the candle flames seem to shiver in their sconces. Fennec went pale. Royal summons. Iselin's stomach tightened before she even understood why. The last times that sound had rung through the castle, it had been to announce her sister's betrothals, Sareth and Ilvena, both with skin like fresh cream, perfectly symmetrical eyes, smiles that looked carved by generous hands. Iselin knew, without needing a mirror, that she hadn't been blessed with the same hand. Her jaw was wide and square, too heavy for the rest of her face, the kind that made hairdressers hesitate before touching it, as if handling a block of raw stone instead of a person. Her nose had a slight twist to it, the result of a childhood fall that never healed quite right. And there was the scar, thin, pale, cutting across her left eyebrow since she was 8, a souvenir from a dog that had bitten her while she tried to protect one of her younger brothers. Nobody ever asked for the story behind it. They just looked and looked away. The throne room, when she arrived, smelled of melted wax and the cold metal of the guard's armor, a smell she'd long associated with moments that never ended well for her. Nobles clustered along the walls in silks that rustled like dry leaves with every movement. Iselin pressed herself against a column, trying to take up as little space as possible, a habit as old as memory itself. That was when she saw the young man standing alone before the throne. Tall brown hair falling stubbornly over gray eyes, hands clasped behind his back in a posture that screamed formal training, but his slightly hunched shoulders gave away someone carrying a weight he hadn't chosen. Iselin felt, against her will, a flicker of recognition. He looked as out of place there as she felt every single day of her life. "This is Cassian Vorharith," announced King Ormond Kaltves, his voice filling every stone corner of the hall like water pouring into a jar until it overflowed. "Heir to House Vorharith. His house has proposed a union that will secure a strong succession for this throne, when I am gone." An expectant hush fell over the room. the kind that precedes an important announcement, when everyone holds their breath at once without realizing it. Isalin was already betting on which sister would be chosen. She even felt a small, almost physical relief at not being the one, because being chosen meant being seen, and being seen for Isalin had always meant being judged. Cassian will marry my daughter Isalin. For 1 second, just one, the world seemed to stop. Then, like a dam breaking, the silence shattered into murmurs that grew too fast to contain. Isalin felt blood rush to her face, hot and ugly, while her feet, without her permission, began moving toward the center of the hall, because that was what was expected of her, even as every cell in her body screamed to run for the nearest door instead. On the way, she saw her sisters' faces. Sereth's mouth hung open, more shocked than relieved. Ilvena, the youngest, bit her lip trying not to laugh, and failed. A laugh escaped, short and sharp, and spread like fire through dry straw across the entire court. "Poor guy," someone whispered, loud enough for half the room to hear. "Stuck marrying the ugly one." Isalin felt the weight of a crown she'd never actually worn, because she'd never been considered worthy enough for the events that called for one. And beside her, she caught her father's face. He wasn't smiling. He didn't look embarrassed. There was something else there, something hard and calculated behind his eyes, like a man who knew exactly what price he was paying and had decided to pay it anyway. "I must have misheard," Isalin said, stopping before the throne, her voice steadier than her racing heart suggested. "You meant Sereth." "I said the right name," Orman replied, without a trace of gentleness. The air in the hall felt heavier now, thick with the smell of wax and the nervous sweat of too many bodies crammed together. Isalin felt the rough fabric of her own gown scrape against her skin. A physical reminder that this wasn't a nightmare. It was real, it was happening, and everyone was watching. "Someone explain this to me," she pressed, lifting her wide chin, refusing to lower her eyes the way everyone always expected her to. Out of 3 daughters, why choose the one nobody ever wanted? The king hesitated. Only a moment. But Isalin knew her father well enough to recognize when he was hiding something behind 2 careful words. "Because you carry the blood that doesn't wash off with marriage," he said, low, almost only for her to hear, though the court's proximity made secrecy impossible. The other 2 wouldn't survive what comes next. A chill ran down Isalin's spine that had nothing to do with the cold stone of the hall. That wasn't an answer. It was a door left cracked open onto something much bigger, something her father wasn't ready to reveal yet, and it left her with more questions than she'd walked in with. It was Cassian who broke the tense silence that followed, stepping forward, a small gesture, but one that visibly broke protocol, since he was meant to remain still until formally presented. "May I speak?" he asked, looking to the king, who nodded, surprised. Cassian turned to Isalin then, not to the court, not to her father, not to the sisters' still stifling giggles behind gloved hands. "I didn't choose this," he said. "My parents decided it, the way they've decided everything in my life since I was born. But I promise you one thing, right here, in front of everyone laughing right now." He extended his hand, not as a gesture of ownership, but as if asking permission, something no one had ever done for Isalin before. People simply assumed things about her, that she was ugly, that she was disposable, that she had no opinion worth hearing. He, standing there, waited. "I didn't come here to laugh at you too," he finished, his voice taking on a weight that silenced even the most persistent whispers in the hall. "And I promise that as long as it's up to me, nobody laughs in your face again without going through me first." Isalin looked at the outstretched hand, then at his face, searching for some trace of disguised pity, some sign that this was all just theater for the crowd. But all she found was a tired young man, as trapped as she was in a fate arranged by other hands. And for the first time in a long while, she felt a dangerous curiosity stirring in her chest, tangled up with a question that refused to stay quiet. What exactly does my father know about me that I still don't? The morning after the announcement, Iselin woke to the smell of burnt toast drifting up from the kitchens 2 floors below, which meant that somewhere down there, a nervous scullery girl had heard the news and forgotten to watch the fire, the way half the castle staff seemed to be doing today, distracted by the scandal of the ugly princess and her unwilling groom. She lay in bed a moment longer than usual, staring at the water stain on her ceiling shaped vaguely like a rabbit, and tried to decide whether last night had actually happened or whether she'd dreamed the whole humiliating spectacle. Then her hand brushed the edge of her nightgown collar, still creased from where she'd fallen asleep without changing. And she knew. Dreams didn't leave you this exhausted. A knock came at her door, brisk and businesslike. "Come to torment me quietly," Iselin called out. "Or come to torment me loudly. I'd like to prepare accordingly." The door opened to reveal her lady's maid, Odessa Marrow, a broad-shouldered woman built like a wine barrel and possessed of absolutely no patience for self-pity, her own or anyone else's. "Neither," Odessa said, already crossing to the wardrobe. "I'm here to dress you because apparently you're expected to have breakfast with your intended, and I will not have you looking like you slept in a hedge while doing it." "I did sleep in a hedge, metaphorically speaking." "Then we'll fix that metaphorically too." Odessa yanked out a deep green gown, held it up, studied Iselin's face with the critical eye of someone who'd dressed her for 11 years and knew exactly which colors made her jaw look softer and which made it look like a doorstop. "This one, it brings out something in your eyes. Pity? Warmth, you impossible girl. Now get up before I dress you myself, and you know I will, because I've done it before, and you cried the whole time about your dignity." Iselin laughed despite herself. A short, surprised sound, because Odessa was the only person in the castle who talked to her like she was simply a person having an inconvenient morning, rather than a cautionary tale walking around in a nightgown. By the time she made it down to the smaller dining hall, her stomach had tied itself into so many knots she doubted breakfast would find room to settle. Cassian was already there, seated at the long table, looking like he'd slept about as well as she had, dark circles under his gray eyes, his hair even more disobedient than the day before, sticking up at the crown like he'd been running his hands through it out of nerves. "You look terrible," Iselin said, sitting across from him. "I mean that as a professional observation. We're clearly matched in suffering." "Good morning to you too." He managed a tired smile. "For what it's worth, I didn't sleep either. I kept running through everything my parents are going to say when I write to them." "What are they going to say?" He hesitated, and Iselin recognized the particular quality of that hesitation, the same one her father had used the night before, the careful selection of words meant to hide more than they revealed. "They're going to be relieved," he said finally, which is its own kind of strange feeling to sit with. Iselin studied him over the rim of her cup, filled with a bitter tea she'd never developed a taste for but drank anyway because it was hot and gave her hands something to do. "Relieved that you're marrying the least wanted daughter in the kingdom?" "Relieved that I'm marrying at all," he corrected, quieter now. "There's been pressure for years. My older brother was supposed to be the one to make an advantageous match, but he stopped himself, jaw tightening. "That's not my story to tell. Point is, the responsibility landed on me instead, and my parents have been anxious to see it settled before—" Another stop. Another wall going up. "Before what?" "Before things at home get complicated," he said. And the way he said it, flat and final, told her the subject was closed for now, at least on his end. Iselin let it go, filing the unfinished sentence away next to her father's unfinished sentence from the night before, building a small collection of things nobody in her life seemed willing to say all the way through. She was getting rather good at collecting silences. "Can I ask you something?" she said instead, turning her cup slowly on its saucer. "And I want an honest answer, not a diplomatic one, because I've had enough diplomatic answers to last several lifetimes. All right, when you first saw me yesterday, before you knew who I was, what did you think?" Cassian went very still, and for one terrible second, Isalin regretted asking, certain she was about to receive the same careful, softened cruelty she'd received her whole life. "You have such a lovely personality, such a clever wit, such interesting features. All the polite ways people had invented to say not pretty without saying it outright. I thought you looked like someone who was trying very hard not to be noticed," he said instead. "And I remember thinking that was strange, because you were clearly the most interesting person in the room." Isalin blinked. Whatever she'd braced herself for, it wasn't that. "That's a very diplomatic non-answer to a question about my face," she said, recovering behind humor because humor was easier than whatever feeling had just lodged itself, warm and unwelcome, beneath her ribs. "You asked what I thought. I told you." Cassian shrugged, a small, almost embarrassed gesture. "I didn't ask you to marry me because of your face, Isalin. Nobody asked either of us anything. So I figured the least I could do was actually look at you instead of just noticing what everyone else notices first." The dining hall door banged open before she could respond, sparing her from having to figure out what to do with the sudden warmth crawling up her neck. King Ormond strode in, trailed by two of his most senior counselors, Lord Beric Thane, thin and sharp-eyed as a blade, and old Matthew Vess, whose hands trembled these days but whose mind, everyone said, remained the sharpest in the kingdom. "Good, you're both here," Ormond said without preamble, without so much as a good morning. "The wedding will take place in 3 weeks." Isalin nearly choked on her tea. 3 weeks? There's no reason to delay. There's every reason to delay. We met yesterday. I don't even know his favorite color. "Gray," Cassian offered helpfully, and Isalin shot him a look that promised retribution later, even as something in her chest loosened slightly at the absurdity of it, at the fact that he was willing to joke in the middle of her father steamrolling both their lives. Ormond did not find it amusing. 3 weeks, he repeated. And there, again, was that hardness behind his eyes that Isalin had noticed the night before, the look of a man carrying something too heavy to set down and too dangerous to share. "There are matters that need settling before I—" He stopped, exactly like Cassian had stopped. Exactly like every important sentence in her life seemed to stop right before the part that mattered. "Before you what, father?" Ormond's gaze flickered, just for a moment, to Lord Beric, who returned it with an expression so carefully neutral that Isalin's instincts, the ones that had spent a lifetime reading rooms for danger before anyone could read her face for flaws, prickled with sudden unease. "Before the kingdom requires stability," Ormond said at last. "That's all you need to know for now." He left before she could push further, counselors trailing behind him like the tail of some restless creature, and Isalin sat there with her cooling tea and her rising questions, aware of Cassian watching her with quiet concern. "He does that a lot?" Cassian asked. "The stopping mid-sentence thing?" "More since last night than ever before," Isalin admitted. "Something's wrong. I don't know what, but something's wrong, and everyone in this castle seems to know except me." "Then we'll find out together," Cassian said, and the "we" landed strangely in her chest. Foreign, unfamiliar. The first time in years anyone had offered to stand beside her in anything rather than simply observing from a comfortable distance. The library at Kaltves Keep had exactly one virtue that Isalin valued above all others. Nobody ever looked for her there. 3 weeks of wedding preparations had turned the castle into a hive of seamstresses, caterers, and nervous stewards, all of them buzzing around Sereth and Ilvena, because naturally, even at Isalin's own wedding, her sisters had somehow become the center of attention, discussing flower arrangements and guest lists as though it were their day and not hers. So she'd retreated to the library, tucked herself into the window seat behind the history section, and pulled out the oldest, dustiest volume she could find, anything to avoid thinking about the fact that in 11 days she would be married to a man she'd known for exactly as long. I thought I might find you hiding somewhere with excellent natural light, came Cassian's voice, and Iselin nearly dropped the book in surprise. I'm not hiding. I'm researching. Researching what? The Kaltves bloodline, she said, tilting the book so he could see the faded illustrations of wolves mid-shift, ink gone brown with age. Something my father said has been bothering me, about blood that doesn't wash off with marriage. I want to know what he meant. Cassian settled onto the window seat across from her without asking permission, close enough that she caught the scent of cedar and horse leather clinging to his riding clothes. He'd clearly come from the training yards, and there was a healthy flush still coloring his cheeks, along with a small cut above one eyebrow that hadn't been there at breakfast. What happened to your face? Sparring accident. Your castle's arms master hits harder than he looks like he should. He touched the cut, wincing slightly, then grinned in a way that suggested the pain was worth the story. I told him I was marrying into this family, and he said, and I quote, "Then you'd better learn to take a hit, because the Kaltves women certainly know how to give one." Iselin laughed, a real laugh this time, unguarded, surprising herself with the sound of it. That's oddly accurate. My mother once broke a serving tray over an ambassador's head for insulting the kitchen staff. I'm terrified and delighted in equal measure. You should be, both at once at all times. That's the correct response to this family. She closed the book, giving up on the research for the moment, unable to concentrate with him sitting so close, radiating warmth like a hearth she hadn't realized she was cold beside. Found anything useful in the training yard at least? Gossip travels faster among soldiers than among nobles in my experience. Actually, yes. His playful expression sobered. One of the older guards mentioned something. Said your father's been meeting with the royal physician more often than usual, late at night, when the halls are supposed to be empty. Iselin went still. The physician doesn't usually see the king unless someone's ill, Cassian finished quietly. The pieces began arranging themselves in her mind, slow and unwelcome, like furniture being dragged into a room she didn't want to enter. Her father's hesitations, the urgency of the wedding, the blood that didn't wash off with marriage. The other two wouldn't survive what comes next. He's dying, she whispered, testing the words, feeling their weight settle into truth even as she said them. That's why the rush. That's why me and not one of my sisters. Because whatever's coming, he thinks I'm the one who can survive it or handle it or... She pressed her palms against her eyes, overwhelmed by a grief she hadn't expected to feel, not for a father who'd spent her whole life looking past her, comparing her, finding her lacking. And yet... Hey. Cassian's hand found hers, gently, not grabbing, just resting there, warm and steady. We don't know anything for certain yet. You believe it too. I can see it on your face. He didn't deny it. I believe something's being hidden, yes. But grieving a possibility before you have the facts will only exhaust you for nothing. Let's find out first. Then feel whatever you need to feel. Iselin looked down at his hand covering hers, at the calluses along his palm from sword and rain, and felt something crack open inside her chest. Not from sadness this time, but from the unfamiliar sensation of someone offering to carry a burden alongside her instead of simply commenting on how heavy it looked from a distance. Why are you being kind to me? She asked, quieter than she meant to. You don't have to be. Nobody would blame you for resenting this whole arrangement, resenting me, going through the motions until the wedding and no further. Cassian was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing an absent, thoughtless line across her knuckles that sent warmth climbing up her arm despite the coolness of the library air. My brother, he said finally, the one I mentioned. He didn't die making an advantageous match. He died running from one. From a woman my parents chose for him. Someone he didn't love and didn't want. And rather than face the wedding, he took a horse out during a storm and never came back. His voice had gone rough, scraped raw around the edges. I watched what happened to a family that forces two unwilling people together and calls it duty. I promised myself, if it ever happened to me, I wouldn't do that to whoever ended up standing across from me. Not because it's noble, because I watched what the alternative costs. Isalin's throat tightened, sympathy for him blooming alongside her own tangled fear about her father, two griefs occupying the same crowded space in her chest. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it entirely, no performance in it at all. "That's an enormous thing to carry." "It's why I extended my hand that day in the throne room," he admitted. "It wasn't performance for the crowd, whatever you thought at the time. It was the only promise I knew how to make that I was certain I could keep." Before she could answer, footsteps echoed through the library entrance, hurried, uneven, nothing like the measured pace of castle staff. Fennec appeared around the corner of the history section, out of breath, his face the color of old parchment. "Princess Iselin," he gasped. "You need to come. It's your father. He's collapsed in the council chamber." The book slid from Iselin's lap, forgotten, as she rose so fast her vision swam. Cassian was on his feet a half-second behind her, his hand finding the small of her back. Not holding her up exactly, just there, steady, present, in case she needed it. "Take me to him," she said, and her voice, to her own surprise, didn't shake. The run through the castle corridors blurred into a haze of tapestries and startled servants pressing themselves against the walls to let her pass, the hem of her gown catching against her ankles, her heart slamming so hard she could feel it in her teeth. When she reached the council chamber, Lord Barrick stood just outside the door, and something about his expression, not grief, not urgency, but a kind of contained, waiting stillness, made her stomach drop even before she crossed the threshold. Inside, her father lay propped against a chair, pale but conscious, the royal physician kneeling beside him with an expression carefully arranged into professional calm. Ormond's eyes found hers immediately, and in them, finally, after weeks of careful evasion, she saw the truth arrive without any more hiding places left to retreat into. "Iselin," he rasped. "There's something I should have told you 3 weeks ago. Something about your blood, and the old pact, and why it has to be you standing beside that boy when the crown finally passes." Cassian's hand tightened briefly against her back. Iselin took a breath, steadying herself against whatever was coming, and stepped fully into the room. "Then tell me now," she said. "All of it. No more stopping mid-sentence." Nobody had ever accused Lord Barrick Thane of wasting words, so when he cleared his throat from the doorway and said, "Perhaps the princess should sit before your majesty continues," Iselin didn't sit. She'd spent her whole life being told to soften her posture, lower her voice, make herself smaller for other people's comfort, and she wasn't about to start now, not with her father lying pale against a chair and the truth finally cracking open in front of her. "I'm fine standing," she said. "Keep going, father." Ormond's hand trembled slightly as he waved the physician back a step, buying himself a moment before the words had to come. Behind Iselin, Cassian remained close, not crowding her, just present, the warmth of him at her shoulder blade like a hand she could reach for without having to ask. "Generations ago," Ormond began, "before this castle had its second wall, before the Cultvest line even wore a crown, our ancestors made an agreement with something that lived in the hollow wood, north of here. You've heard the stories. Everyone dismisses them as fireside nonsense for children." "The Wood Mother," Iselin said slowly, memory surfacing from nursery tales she'd half forgotten. "The spirit who supposedly protected the first settlers from the wolves that used to run wild through these hills." "Not protected," Ormond corrected, wincing as he shifted his weight. "Bargained. The wolves back then weren't simple animals, Iselin. They were something older, something that could take a human shape when it suited them, and they were tearing our ancestors apart faster than any wall could stop them. So the first Cultvest king made a pact with the Wood Mother. She wove a protection around our bloodline in exchange for a promise. Every third generation, one child born to the Kaltves line would carry her mark, hidden until the moment it was needed. And when the mark surfaced, that child would be bound to stand as guardian between the wolves and the kingdom, whether they wanted the role or not. Isalin felt the room tilt slightly, though she hadn't moved. That's a fairy tale. It was a fairy tale, Ormond said, until 3 months ago, when the physician found this. He pulled back the loose sleeve of his own robe, revealing, just above his wrist, a faint silver marking shaped almost like a leaf skeleton, veins branching delicately across old skin. Isalin had seen that mark before, she just hadn't known to look for it. She'd seen it on her own wrist, faint as a birthmark, dismissed her whole life as nothing more than a strange discoloration she'd learned to cover with long sleeves because it was one more thing people stared at. You have it too, Ormond said quietly, watching her face. You've had it since birth. I've watched it for years, waiting to see whether it would ever wake, praying it wouldn't. Because waking means the wolves are stirring again in the hollow wood, and it means the mark has chosen its bearer for this generation. Isalin's fingers found the edge of her own sleeve without her permission, pushing it back to reveal the mark she'd spent years explaining away to curious maids and concerned physicians. It was brighter now than she remembered. Silver, almost luminous, faintly warm beneath her fingertips. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Because I hoped it would skip you, Ormond admitted. And for the first time in Isalin's memory, something like shame crossed her father's face. I hoped it would pass to Sereth or Ilvena instead. Some part of me hoped that, because the bearer's mate must stand with them against what's coming, and I didn't think anyone would choose to stand beside. He stopped himself. But this time, Isalin finished the sentence in her own head without needing him to say it aloud. Beside the daughter nobody wanted. The unfairness of it landed somewhere old and tender. A bruise she'd carried so long she'd almost stopped noticing its shape. Her own father had hoped the burden would fall on a prettier daughter, not because he doubted Isalin's strength, but because he doubted anyone would love her enough to stand at her side through it. That's why you rushed the wedding, Cassian said slowly, understanding arriving alongside Isalin's own. You needed her bonded to someone before the mark fully woke, before whatever's coming arrives. Ormond nodded, wincing again as the physician pressed a compress against his temple. The pact requires the bearer to be bound, married, truly chosen, not merely engaged, before the mark reaches full strength, or the protection fails, and the wolves come through unchecked. I didn't have the luxury of choosing a suitor who loved her first and married her second. I had weeks, maybe days. I chose the match most likely to hold. You mean you chose the family desperate enough to agree without asking too many questions, Isalin said, an old anger sharpening her voice even now, even with a supernatural crisis unfolding around her. You didn't choose him for me? You chose convenience. I chose wisely, Ormond said, meeting her eyes despite his obvious pain. Whatever the reason behind it, look at who's standing beside you right now, Isalin. Look at who didn't leave the room when the story turned strange. Isalin didn't look. She couldn't, not yet. Not with her chest so full of contradictory feelings she couldn't separate one from another. Fury at her father, fear of the wolves in the hollow wood, and underneath all of it, unwelcome and persistent, a flicker of gratitude that at least the marriage he'd engineered out of desperation had handed her someone who kept choosing, again and again, to stay. The training yard behind the east wall had gone quiet by the time Isalin found Cassian there the next evening, working through sword forms alone in the fading light, his shirt sticking to his back with sweat, moving with a focus that suggested he was trying to outrun his own thoughts rather than simply practice. You're going to exhaust yourself, she said, leaning against the fence post. Good. Exhausted is easier than thinking. He lowered the blade, chest heaving. Your father just told me I'm marrying into a pact with wolf spirits and an ancient forest guardian. I needed to hit something that wasn't a metaphor. Understandable. She climbed over the low fence, ignoring his raised eyebrow at the very unprincess-like maneuver, and settled onto the overturned crate he usually used for a water bucket. For what it's worth, I've had 3 months longer than you to sit with a version of this, and I still don't feel remotely prepared. Cassian sat across from her on the ground, sword set aside, forearms resting on his knees. Can I ask you something? Honestly, not diplomatically, since apparently that's our thing now. Go ahead. Are you angry at me for agreeing to this before either of us knew what it actually meant? Isalin considered the question seriously instead of deflecting with a joke, which surprised her more than it surprised him. I was angry at the situation, at my father mostly, and a little at the universe for handing me one more thing to be extraordinary about instead of just letting me be plain and unremarkable and left alone. She picked at a loose thread on her sleeve, avoiding his eyes. But no, not angry at you. You've done nothing but show up steadier than anyone expected, including me. That's the second nicest thing you've said to me since we met. Don't get used to it. My default setting is sharp-tongued and suspicious of kindness. I've noticed. I find it oddly charming. He grinned, and something about the easy warmth of it made her stomach do a small, unfamiliar flip that she chose to blame on the cool evening air rather than examine too closely. For what it's worth, I meant what I said in the throne room. I'm not going anywhere, ancient wolf packs included. You say that now. Wait until something with too many teeth actually shows up. I already have several teeth's worth of scars from training exercises gone wrong. I think I'll manage. She laughed, the sound escaping before she could stop it, and Cassian's expression shifted into something quieter, more careful, watching her laugh like it was a rare bird he didn't want to startle away. Your laugh is different than your voice, he said. Softer. You should do it more often. Heat crept up her neck, and she busied herself adjusting her sleeve rather than meet his eyes, though the mark beneath the fabric pulsed faintly warm against her wrist, as if responding to something in the moment she couldn't name. Careful, Cassian. Compliments like that will give a girl ideas. What kind of ideas? The kind that get complicated when you remember we're only doing this because my father's dying, and some forest spirit needs its guardian bound in time. The playfulness between them cooled slightly, replaced by something heavier, more honest. Cassian reached over, slowly enough that she had every chance to pull away if she wanted, and rested his hand over hers where it sat on her knee. Then let's not think about the reasons for one evening, he said. Let's just be two people sitting in a training yard at sunset, figuring out if we like each other beyond the circumstances that threw us together. And if we find out we don't? Then at least we'll know honestly, instead of guessing forever. His thumb moved gently across her knuckles, the same absent gesture from the library, and Iselin found herself leaning slightly toward the warmth of him without deciding to. But for the record, I already suspect we do. Like each other, I mean. Bold assumption from a man who's known me 5 days. I've known you 5 days and watched you stand in a throne room full of people laughing at you and refuse to shrink 1 inch. I've watched you research ancient bloodlines instead of falling apart when your father collapsed. I've watched you make jokes about wolf attacks instead of panicking. He met her eyes, steady, unflinching. I don't need 5 years to recognize someone remarkable, Iselin. Some things you just see. The words landed somewhere deep and unguarded, past every defense she'd built over years of being told. In 100 careful and uncareful ways, that remarkable wasn't a word anyone would reach for to describe her. She felt her throat tighten, unexpected emotion rising fast enough to catch her off guard. Nobody's ever said something like that to me before, she admitted, quieter than she meant to, all her usual sharpness momentarily disarmed. Then everyone before me was an idiot, Cassian said simply, and I intend to spend however long we have making up for it. The evening settled around them, the sky bruising into soft purples above the castle walls, crickets beginning their nightly chorus somewhere beyond the fence. Iselin didn't pull her hand away, and for the first time since the sound of those 3 bells had shattered her ordinary morning, she let herself simply sit inside a moment, without bracing for the next humiliation, the next disappointment, the next reminder of everything she wasn't. Somewhere beyond the hollow wood, unseen and unheard, something old was beginning to stir. But for one quiet evening at least, Iselin allowed herself to believe that whatever came next, she wouldn't be facing it alone. The wedding, when it finally arrived, smelled like crushed lavender and candle smoke, and Iselin spent most of the ceremony trying not to think about the fact that her hands wouldn't stop shaking beneath the sleeves of a gown 3 seamstresses had cried over while fitting. "You look like you're about to be sick," Odessa whispered, adjusting the circlet in Iselin's hair for the 3rd time in as many minutes. "I might be." "Is that allowed at weddings?" "Only if you aim away from the guests." Iselin laughed despite herself, grateful for Odessa's blunt humor steadying her nerves as the great doors of the chapel swung open. She'd expected to feel like a spectacle walking down that aisle. She'd spent her whole life being stared at for the wrong reasons, after all. But when she found Cassian's eyes waiting at the end of the aisle, something in his expression made the room's other faces blur into unimportance. He looked at her the way she'd only ever seen people look at her sisters, like she was worth looking at. The ceremony passed in a haze of vows and old words she barely registered, and then his hand was in hers, warm and steady, and the mark on her wrist flared bright silver beneath her sleeve, hot enough that she gasped, drawing concerned murmurs from the front rows. "Are you all right?" Cassian whispered. "The mark," she breathed. "It's—" Before she could finish, the silver light spread up her arm like frost blooming across glass, delicate branching patterns crawling toward her shoulder, and across the chapel, gasps rippled through the assembled nobles. Orman, seated in a chair near the altar because he could no longer stand for long, watched with an expression caught somewhere between relief and grief. "It's done," he said, voice carrying despite its weakness. "The bond is sealed. May the Wood Mother's protection hold a little longer." The reception that followed felt like something happening to someone else. Iselin dancing through obligatory steps with nobles she barely knew, while the mark's warmth pulsed steadily beneath her sleeve, no longer painful, just present, like a second heartbeat she'd have to learn to live alongside. It was well past midnight, most of the guests finally gone, when Lord Barrick approached her near the wine table, his thin face arranged into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Congratulations, Your Highness," he said, the title still strange in her ears. "Quite the eventful evening. That mark of yours put on quite a show." "Thank you, Lord Barrick." "I do wonder," he continued, swirling his own goblet idly, "whether your father fully explained what happens once the Hollow Wood Pact activates completely. The old stories aren't kind about what the bearer sacrifices in the end." Something cold slid down Iselin's spine. "What do you mean?" But Barrick only smiled wider, the expression more unsettling for its calm. "Ask your father. I'm sure he'll get around to telling you eventually. He's been rather selective about timing, historically." He bowed, shallow and precise, and melted back into the thinning crowd before she could press further. Cassian found her moments later, brow furrowed at whatever expression she wore. "What did he say to you?" "Something designed to frighten me without actually telling me anything." She wrapped her arms around herself despite the warmth of the hall. "I don't trust him, Cassian. There's something underneath his politeness that feels like a blade wrapped in silk." "Then we'll find out what he's hiding," Cassian said, echoing the promise from weeks before, and for the first time that whole overwhelming day, Iselin felt something settle instead of spin. 3 weeks into her marriage, Iselin had learned exactly 2 new things about her husband. He snored softly when he slept on his back, which she found unreasonably endearing, and he hummed old marching tunes under his breath whenever he was anxious. which he apparently was right now, pacing the length of their chambers with a letter clutched in one fist. "You're going to wear a groove into the floor," she said, looking up from the book she'd been failing to read for the last 20 minutes, distracted by his restless circling. "What's the letter?" "From my father." Cassian's jaw was tight in a way she'd only seen once before, the day he'd mentioned his brother. "He's requesting I return home. Says there are matters requiring my attention at House for Hareth." "That sounds ominous." "It's probably just business. Grain shortages, tenant disputes, the usual." But his voice lacked conviction, and Isalin set her book aside entirely, recognizing the particular strain in his shoulders. "Cassian, tell me the truth, not the polite version." He exhaled slowly, sitting on the edge of their bed, letter still crumpled in his hand. "My father's never been a warm man. Ambitious, calculating, the sort who sees people as pieces to move rather than souls to consider. When my brother died, I watched him grieve for exactly 3 days before he started asking which of the remaining sons could still salvage the marriage alliance he'd lost. He rubbed his face with both hands. "I love my mother. She's gentle, kind in ways my father never learned to be. But him! I've spent my whole life trying to be useful enough that he wouldn't look at me the way he looked at my brother at the end. Disappointed, like a bad investment." Isalin moved to sit beside him, her hand finding his without needing to think about it, the gesture as natural now as breathing. "That's not altruism buying your affection, Cassian. That's fear wearing altruism's clothes." "I know that logically. Doesn't stop the fear. When do you have to leave?" "He wants me there within the week. Alone." Cassian met her eyes, something apologetic in them. "I don't want to leave you here, not with everything unresolved about the pact, about Barrick's warning, about your father's health. But I don't know how to refuse him without consequences I can't predict." "Then I'll come with you." "Isalin." "I'm your wife," she said, firm despite the flutter of nerves in her own stomach at the word, still new enough to feel borrowed. "Whatever waits at House for Hareth, we face it together, same as we agreed to face everything else. Besides," she added, softer, "I'd like to meet the family that raised someone who extends his hand to strangers in throne rooms instead of laughing along with everyone else." Something in Cassian's face cracked open. Gratitude and affection mingling so plainly, she felt her own chest tighten in response. He leaned forward slowly, giving her every chance to pull back, and pressed his forehead gently against hers. "I don't deserve you," he murmured. "No," she agreed, a teasing warmth in her voice that softened the words entirely. "But you're stuck with me regardless, so you'd better get used to the idea." He laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind that transformed his whole face, and the sound of it settled something loose and anxious in Iselin's chest. Whatever waited at House for Hareth, whatever Lord Barrick's cryptic warning meant, whatever the mark on her wrist was still building toward beneath her skin, she found herself facing it with something she'd rarely possessed before this marriage. The steady, unfamiliar certainty that she wouldn't be facing it alone. Outside their window, far beyond the castle walls, the hollow wood stood dark and silent under a rising moon, and something within its shadowed depths had begun, at last, to move. House for Hareth's manor rose out of the fog like something carved from old bone, pale stone, narrow windows, gardens trimmed with a precision that felt less like beauty and more like control. Isalin had expected grandness. She hadn't expected the particular chill that settled over her the moment she crossed the threshold, as if the house itself had learned to hold its breath around certain people. "Charming," she muttered, earning a strained smile from Cassian as a steward led them through corridors hung with portraits of stern-faced Vorhareth ancestors, none of them smiling, all of them watching. Lord Dresden Vorhareth received them in his study rather than a proper receiving hall, already a small insult, Isalin suspected, meant to establish who controlled the terms of this visit. He was a tall man, silver at the temples, with Cassian's same gray eyes but none of the warmth that made his son's version of them kind. He looked at Isalin for exactly 2 seconds before dismissing her entirely, turning his attention to his son. "You took your time," Dresden said. "I have a wife now, father. Travel arrangements take longer with 2 people." "Yes, I heard about your wife." Dresden's gaze flicked back to Isalin, cool and assessing, the same look she'd endured her whole life dressed up in aristocratic patience. The Kaltves pact-bearer, quite the convenient arrangement for a marriage nobody else wanted to make. "Say what you actually mean, father," Cassian said, and Isalin heard, beneath the careful control in his voice, an old exhaustion, the sound of a son who'd had this exact conversation many times before in many different disguises. "Very well." Dresden set down his pen with deliberate calm. "The kingdom's grain reserves have failed for the 2nd year running. Tenant unrest grows in 3 territories bordering ours. This house needs resources, and resources require standing, and standing requires more than a marriage to a dying king's least favored daughter." "Careful," Cassian said, low and sharp, stepping slightly in front of Isalin without seeming to realize he'd done it. "You're speaking about my wife." "I'm speaking facts. The girl carries an ancient mark tied to a forest pact nobody in this century properly understands. That mark, once fully awakened, may hold power this house desperately needs. Land rights over the hollow wood, exemption from certain crown taxes historically granted to pact-bound families. I've already sent inquiries to the crown archivists." Dresden's eyes returned to Isalin, calculating now in a way that made her skin crawl. "The question is whether you two intend to actually use what you've been given, or waste it being sentimental." Isalin felt something old and defensive rise in her chest. Not surprise exactly, because she'd expected cruelty from a man like this the moment she walked through his door, but a fresh, sharp reminder that to some people, she would always be a resource before she was a person. "I am not a land deed, Lord Vorhareth," she said, voice steady despite her racing pulse. "And whatever this mark becomes, it isn't yours to negotiate." Dresden's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Feisty. I suppose that's useful, given what my son married into." He turned back to his papers, dismissing them both with the gesture. "We'll discuss terms further at dinner. I trust you'll both be more accommodating once you understand what's actually at stake for this family's survival." Once they'd retreated to the guest chambers, Cassian sank onto the edge of the bed, head in his hands, and Isalin sat beside him, resisting the urge to say something sharp about his father, sensing the wound underneath his silence needed something gentler first. "He's always been like this," Cassian said finally. "Everything measured in usefulness. My brother used to say our father loved the idea of family more than the actual people in it." He looked up, eyes tired. "I'm sorry. I should have prepared you better for how cold he'd be." "You don't need to apologize for your father's cruelty, Cassian. That's not a debt you owe me." She took his hand, threading her fingers through his. "But I do need to know, does he have any actual power over us? Legally, I mean. Could he force some claim on the pact, or on me?" Cassian's jaw tightened. "I don't know, and that terrifies me more than I want to admit." Dinner that evening confirmed every instinct Isalin's stomach had been screaming since they'd arrived. Dresden spent the meal steering conversation relentlessly toward the pact, asking pointed questions about the mark's properties, how it activated, whether it responded to blood, to intention, to proximity with the hollow wood itself. Isalin answered as vaguely as she dared, watching Cassian grow more rigid beside her with every question, until finally, Dresden set down his goblet and addressed his son directly. "I've arranged for scholars from the capital to examine the mark next week. Purely academic interest, of course." "No," Cassian said, flat and immediate. Dresden's eyebrows rose. "I beg your pardon? You heard me? No scholars, no examinations, no negotiations over my wife's body like she's a contract clause." Cassian stood, chair scraping harshly against stone. I understand this house needs resources. I understand you're frightened for our future, and some small part of me even understands why you've become the man sitting across this table. But I will not let you use her, Father. Not for grain reserves, not for land rights, not for anything. Dresden's expression flickered, something briefly uncertain crossing features that had spent decades perfecting control. And for one strange moment, Isalin glimpsed something almost human underneath the calculation. A frightened man, watching a house he'd inherited crumble slowly under debts and bad harvests, grasping for any leverage that might save the people depending on him, however cruelly he went about seeking it. You think this is easy for me? Dresden said, quieter now, some of the performance stripped away. I buried one son already because I pushed too hard, too fast, without ever learning restraint. I am trying, in my own broken way, to keep the rest of this family from starving. I don't expect you to understand that. I barely understand it myself some days. The admission hung uneasily in the air, complicating the clean villainy Isalin had assigned him only hours before. He was still wrong, still cruel in his methods, still willing to treat her as currency rather than a person. But beneath the coldness, she recognized something achingly familiar. A parent making terrible choices out of desperate love, twisted unrecognizably by fear. Then find another way, Isalin said, surprising herself by speaking gently instead of sharply. Not through me. Not through my mark. There has to be another path that doesn't require selling out your son's wife. Dresden studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. Perhaps, he said finally. Or perhaps desperation doesn't leave room for perhaps. He left the table without finishing his meal, and Isalin watched him go, unable to decide whether she pitied him or feared him more, suspecting, uneasily, that the answer might end up being both in equal, complicated measure. The scream tore through the manor just after midnight, and Isalin was on her feet before she'd fully woken, Cassian already at the door, sword in hand from habit alone. That came from the east wing, he said. The stables. They ran together through corridors gone suddenly cold, past portraits that seemed to watch with sharper attention than before, until they reached the courtyard, where several grooms stood frozen before the stable doors. Torn clean off their hinges, splintered wood scattered across frost-covered stone, 3 of the finest horses missing from their stalls entirely. Something came through the wall, one of the grooms stammered, pointing at a gap torn through solid stone as though it were parchment. Old Hale tried to stop it. He's hurt bad, my lord. We've got him inside. But the horses, it just took them, dragged them off toward the tree line like they weighed nothing at all. Isalin's blood ran cold. She crossed to the shattered wall, and there, embedded in the broken stone, she found it, a single silver leaf, identical to the pattern on her own wrist, except this one seemed to pulse with something darker, angrier, like a bruise beneath skin. The Woodmother's mark, she whispered. But wrong. Twisted. The pact is failing, came Dresden's voice behind them, and Isalin turned to find him standing in the courtyard entrance, face gray with something that looked, for the first time since they'd arrived, like genuine fear rather than calculation. I made inquiries to the Crown Archivist, yes, but not only for land rights. I wanted to understand what happens when a bearer's mark activates without proper completion. The scholars I summoned aren't coming to examine your wife for profit, Cassian. They're coming because I fear what's loose in these woods now might not wait for anyone's convenience. You knew this could happen, Cassian said, voice shaking with barely restrained fury. And you said nothing? I suspected. I didn't want to believe it. Dresden's composure cracked fully now, years of careful control crumbling into something raw and frightened. The old texts say when a bearer marries without fully embracing the bond, without true, freely chosen love, not merely legal completion, the protection weakens instead of strengthening. The wolves sense the crack in the seal. They come through it. Isalin's stomach dropped, the mark on her wrist suddenly burning hot enough to make her gasp. She looked at Cassian, searching his face for the answer to a question she was almost too afraid to voice aloud. "Do we not—" she started. "Don't," Cassian said fiercely, gripping her hand. "Don't you dare finish that sentence like it's a small thing. Whatever complications my father's timeline created, what I feel for you isn't a legal formality, Iselin. I need you to know that, especially now." But even as he said it, doubt flickered behind his eyes. Not doubt of his feelings, she realized, but doubt of whether feelings alone, however real, could undo whatever damage a rushed, desperate wedding had already done to an ancient magic that apparently required more than good intentions to hold. Old Hale, the stable master, was carried past them on a makeshift stretcher, groaning, a deep gash along his ribs where claws had caught him trying to shield the horses. Isalin knelt briefly beside him, gripping his hand. "You'll be all right," she told him, though she wasn't entirely certain of it herself. "The physician's coming." "Wasn't natural, milady," Hale rasped. Whatever took those horses wasn't natural at all. Outside, past the shattered stable wall, past the manor's careful gardens, a long, mournful howl rose from the direction of the hollow wood, closer than any wolf should have been able to travel in a single night, closer than anything natural should allow. "They're coming here," Dresden whispered, and for once, nobody in the room doubted him. "They're coming for the bearer whose bond isn't strong enough to hold them back." Cassian turned to Iselin, jaw set with fierce determination beneath the fear. "Then we make it strong enough. Whatever that requires. I am not losing you to a mistake my father's ambition helped create." Iselin looked down at the mark pulsing angrily against her skin, then up at her husband's face, steady, afraid, and entirely unwilling to leave her side no matter what came howling out of the dark, and felt something shift inside her chest, resolve hardening into place beside the fear. "Then let's go meet them," she said, "before they reach anyone else inside these walls who never asked to be caught in the middle of any of this." Behind them, the household staff began barring what remained of the stable doors, and somewhere in the dark beyond the torn wall, the howls grew louder, closer, patient in a way that made every hair on Isalin's arms rise. The howls multiplied as the night wore on, circling the manor like a tightening noose, each cry closer than the last, until the frost-covered garden seemed to hum with the pressure of something enormous gathering just beyond sight. Isalin stood at the window of their guest chamber, watching shapes flicker between the trees, and felt the mark on her wrist pulse with a heat that had nothing comforting in it anymore. "They're testing the boundary," Cassian said, buckling his sword belt with hands that weren't quite steady. "Getting braver. You heard your father. The bond isn't strong enough yet. Whatever's coming, force alone won't stop it. Force is what I know how to do, Isalin." His jaw was set in a way she recognized now, stubborn, frightened beneath the stubbornness. A man reaching for the only tool he trusted because the alternative meant standing exposed with nothing but feelings he wasn't certain were enough. "Let me try. Let me at least try to buy us time before we gamble everything on something neither of us fully understands." She wanted to argue. Some instinct in her chest already knew that swords wouldn't solve what ancient magic had broken. But she also recognized the particular fear driving him, the same fear that had made him spar alone in the training yard weeks before, exhausting his body because it was easier than sitting still with uncertainty. And she understood that sometimes a person needed to fail at the wrong solution before they could trust the right one. "Try," she said, "but come back to me after. Whatever happens." Cassian kissed her forehead, quick and fierce, and was gone before she could say anything more, descending toward the garden with 3 of Dresden's household guards trailing uncertainly behind him. Isalin watched from the window as they approached the tree line, torches raised, blades drawn, moving with the careful discipline of trained men facing an enemy they didn't understand. For a moment nothing happened. The wolf shape simply watched from the shadows, eyes glowing that unnatural silver green, patient in a way that made the hair on Yisalin's arms rise. Then Cassian shouted something she couldn't hear, and the guards surged forward. It went wrong immediately. The largest shape, the flickering thing that moved between wolf and something almost human, simply stepped aside from the first blade swung at it, unhurried, contemptuous, and the guard who'd swung stumbled past it into empty air, overbalanced by a target that was no longer there. A second wolf shape darted low and fast, and Yisalin's heart lurched as one of the household guards went down hard, though she saw, with weak relief, that he was scrambling backward rather than lying still, wounded perhaps, but alive. "Cassian!" she screamed, already moving for the stairs, dagger in hand, unable to simply watch from a window while he faced something that clearly outmatched steel. By the time she reached the garden, breathless, skirts tangled around her ankles from the frantic run, she found Cassian on one knee in the frost, sword arm hanging at an odd angle, blood darkening his sleeve from a shallow gash. The flickering shape stood over him, unhurried, almost curious, as though it found the whole display faintly disappointing. "Steel cannot cut what was never fully flesh," the voice said inside Yisalin's skull, cold and ancient, and she realized with a sick lurch that it was speaking to her now, not to Cassian. "Your mate fights with the only language he trusts. But this was never a battle for swords, little bearer. I grow tired of waiting for you both to understand that." "Get back!" Cassian shouted at her, struggling upright despite his injured arm, placing himself between Iselin and the creature, with a stubbornness that would have been almost funny in any other circumstance. "Yisalin, get back inside. I'm not leaving you out here. I can't protect you if you won't let me. Maybe I don't need protecting the way you think I do," she snapped back, fear sharpening into something closer to frustration. Maybe swinging swords at something that isn't fully flesh was never going to work, and you knew that before you tried. And you did it anyway because standing still and trusting a bond neither of us fully understands terrifies you more than getting hurt does. Cassian froze, the truth of it landing visibly across his face, and for a moment the flickering creature simply watched them both, patient as stone, as though it had all the time in the world and found their argument almost entertaining. "Yes," the voice whispered, and this time it seemed to address them both. "Now perhaps we arrive at something honest." Dresden appeared at the garden's edge, breathless, having followed the commotion from the manor, and the sight of the wounded guard being helped back toward the house seemed to strip away whatever composure remained in him. "Enough," he said, voice cracking. "Cassian, get back. You're only feeding its patience with your defiance. Yisalin." He stopped, staring at her, something helpless and guilty in his expression. "I don't know how to fix what I helped break. I rushed this marriage's terms through my own ambition, pressured your father's timeline to serve my own house's needs, and now I don't know how to undo it." "You can't undo it," Yisalin said. "None of us can undo the timeline. We can only decide what we do with what's left." But even as she said it, doubt crept cold and unwelcome into her chest, worse than any wolf's growl. What if it wasn't enough? What if whatever she felt for Cassian, real as it was, warm and steady, and entirely unlike anything she'd expected to find in a marriage built from desperation, simply wasn't the kind of love ancient magic required? She'd spent her whole life being told she was insufficient in 100 small, cutting ways. What if this was simply one more area where she came up short? And this time the cost wasn't her own pride, but everyone sheltering inside those manor walls. "You doubt," the voice observed almost gently, more unsettling for its softness than any threat could have been. "Good. Doubt is honest. Let us see what remains once you strip away the performance of certainty." The flickering shape began to circle them slowly, and more wolf forms emerged from the tree line to join it, a widening ring of silver-green eyes catching moonlight, patient and hungry and endlessly old. Yisalin felt panic clawing up her throat, not at the wolves themselves, but at the sudden, suffocating fear that she'd built her entire sense of safety these past months on something that might not hold, the way nothing in her life before Cassian had ever quite held either. Her sister's beauty had never been enough to earn her father's full attention. Her sharp wit had never been enough to earn suitors' interest. What if love itself, real, chosen, freely given love, simply wasn't enough either? Not against something this old, this patient, this certain of its own eventual victory? "I don't know if I'm enough for this," she admitted, quiet and raw, the words slipping free before she could stop them, meant for Cassian, though the wolves surely heard them too. "I've spent my whole life being told in 100 different ways that I fall short of what's needed. What if this is just one more thing I can't be enough for?" Cassian turned to her fully then, ignoring the circling wolves entirely, ignoring his own bleeding arm, and took her face in both hands with a gentleness that contrasted sharply against the danger surrounding them. "Listen to me," he said, fierce and certain in a way that cut through her spiraling doubt like a blade through fog. "You are not falling short of anything. You never have been. Every person who ever made you feel small was wrong, Iselin. Not exaggerating, not partially mistaken, entirely wrong. And I am not choosing you because some ancient pact requires it, or because my father's timeline forced my hand, or because it's convenient. I choose you because in 3 months you have shown me more courage, more wit, more genuine kindness underneath all that sharp armor than I have found in 26 years of moving through rooms full of people my father called important." The wolves drew closer, the ring tightening, but Cassian didn't look away from her face. "I choose you right now," he continued, voice carrying clear across the frost-covered garden, deliberate and unhurried despite the danger closing in. "Not because a mark on your wrist requires a bonded mate, and not because I already said vows in a chapel 3 weeks ago. I choose you because when I imagine the rest of my life, I want it to be loud with your laughter and sharp with your wit, and steady with whatever this feeling is that I've never had a better word for than love. That is my choice, freely made. Right now, with wolves at our backs and everything on the line, in case there was ever any doubt that circumstance forced my hand." Something in Iselin's chest cracked open, not from fear this time, but from the sheer force of being chosen, actively, deliberately, with nothing forcing the words except his own certainty. "I choose you too," she said, and this time there was no hesitation in it at all, no doubt clawing beneath the words. "Not because my father engineered this marriage, not because some pact needs a bearer's mate. I choose you because you looked at me in a throne room full of laughter and saw someone worth extending your hand to, and you have kept extending it every single day since. And I would choose that hand 1,000 times over, in 1,000 different circumstances, wolves or no wolves, pacts or no pacts." The mark on her wrist flared, not the sickly silver green of the creature's magic, but a deep, warm gold, spreading up her arm in slow, deliberate waves, like dawn breaking after an impossibly long night. Cassian gasped as a matching warmth bloomed from his own hand, where it touched her face, gold light threading between his fingers and her skin, binding them together in something that felt, for the first time, entirely complete. The flickering creature stopped its circling. "This," it said, voice losing some of its ancient coldness, replaced by something almost like wonder. "This is what the old pact required. Not haste. Not legal binding alone. Chosen and chosen again, freely, with nothing forcing the choice, but truth." "Then take your protection and hold," Iselin said, gripping Cassian's hand tighter as the golden light built between them, pushing back against the wolves' unnatural glow until the creatures at the tree line began to whimper, retreating step by uncertain step. "We've done our part, freely, honestly, with nothing false in it. Now honor what our ancestors bargained for." The flickering shape let out a sound that might have been a howl, or might have been something closer to release, and then In a ripple of silver light gone suddenly gentle, the wolves began to fade back into the tree line, their forms dissolving like morning mist under warming sun, until only silence and frost-crusted grass remained where they'd stood. And to everyone's quiet relief, the missing horses trotted back out of the tree line moments later, unharmed, coats damp with dew, as if simply returning from an unplanned evening pasture. Cassian sank to his knees in the frost, exhaustion and relief overtaking him at once, and Isalin dropped down beside him, checking his wounded arm with hands that finally stopped shaking. "You're an idiot," she said, half laughing, half crying, pressing her sleeve against his cut to slow the bleeding. "Charging in with a sword against something that isn't fully flesh. I know." He winced as she tightened the makeshift bandage. "I panicked. I wanted to protect you the only way I knew how, and it wasn't the way that actually mattered." "No," she agreed, softer now. "But you tried anyway, because that's who you are. And then you chose the harder thing, standing still, being honest, trusting something you couldn't control with a sword. That's harder than charging into danger, Cassian. That takes a different kind of courage." Dresden approached slowly across the frosted grass, staring at the golden light still fading gently from both their hands, his face a complicated mixture of relief and shame. "I nearly cost you everything," he said quietly. "My ambition, my fear for this house's survival, my rushed pressure on the timeline. I nearly let it fracture a bond that just saved all our lives." "You did nearly cost us everything," Cassian said, no warmth softening the words, though exhaustion had worn away some of his anger. "But you also warned us the moment you understood the danger, instead of hiding it for your own gain. That matters, Father. Not enough to erase what came before it, but enough to build something better from, if you're willing to try." Dresden nodded, throat working visibly, and for the first time in Isalin's brief acquaintance with him, he looked less like a calculating lord and more like a frightened man grateful for an undeserved second chance. "I'll find another way to save this house," he said. "One that doesn't require selling out the people I claim to love." Old Hale recovered fully within the week, and swore to anyone who'd listen that he'd never touch a drop of ale again after what he'd seen that night. A promise the household staff quietly bet against with good humor, restoring something like normalcy to a manor that badly needed it. Word arrived from Kaltves Keep 3 days later, delivered by an exhausted rider who'd changed horses twice to make the journey faster. King Ormond had taken a sharp turn for the worse and wished to see his daughter before the end. Isalin and Cassian rode through the night to reach him, arriving just as dawn broke pink over the castle's eastern towers, Cassian's arm still bandaged but healing. Isalin's mark settled now into a steady, permanent gold that no longer flared with strain of any kind. Ormond lay propped against pillows, weaker than she'd ever seen him, but his eyes cleared with recognition when she entered. "The mark," he said, voice thin as paper. "It's whole. I can see it in you, steady now, not straining, not cracked. We bonded truly, Father, freely in the end, not just legally." Isalin took his hand, old resentment softening in the face of his obvious frailty. "The Wood Mother accepted it. The wolves have gone quiet." Relief washed visibly across his face. "Then I did one thing right, at least, however clumsily I went about it." He squeezed her fingers with what strength remained. "I'm sorry, Isalin. For every year I let you believe you were less than your sisters. I chose you for this burden because I knew, somewhere underneath my own blindness, that you were the strongest of my daughters. I should have told you that decades before I needed something from you." Tears she hadn't expected slipped free. Years of old hurt finally finding somewhere to land instead of somewhere to hide. "I forgive you," she whispered, and found, to her surprise, that she meant it entirely. Ormond passed 2 days later, peacefully, surrounded by all 3 of his daughters for the first time in years. Sareth and Ilvena arriving in time to say their own goodbyes. old sisterly distances softening in shared grief. The crown passed to Iselin and Cassian together, as the old pact required, and the kingdom, weary from years of uncertain rule, welcomed a new queen who'd spent her whole life being underestimated and had learned, through fire and frost and ancient magic, exactly what she was capable of when finally given the chance to choose, and be chosen freely. Epilogue. 2 years later, Iselin stood at the same window where she'd once watched Cassian walk into danger with a sword he didn't yet know wouldn't be enough, and felt only peace settle over the quiet gardens below, frost long since given way to full summer green. The mark on her wrist had long since settled into a permanent, gentle warmth, no longer flaring with danger, simply present, a quiet reminder of everything survived and everything chosen freely, twice over when it mattered most. Cassian found her there, slipping an arm around her waist, a letter still in his other hand. "Lord Vorharith's letter arrived this morning," he said. "The Eastern Territories report a good harvest this year. My father's finally learning that honest dealing serves a house better than desperate scheming ever did." "People can change," Iselin said, leaning into him, "when someone finally gives them a reason worth changing for, and the courage to choose it themselves instead of being forced." Below them, in the courtyard, Odessa was scolding a younger maid about proper tea temperatures with her usual blunt affection, and Fennec sat under the shade of an old oak, teaching a new apprentice how to properly balance a ledger, the ordinary rhythms of a kingdom at peace, unremarkable and precious for exactly that reason. Outside, beyond the castle walls, the hollow wood stood peaceful under summer sunlight. Wolves and spirits settled back into old, quiet balance, a lasting reminder that some bonds, forged not from duty but from truth, chosen again and again, held stronger than any ancient magic ever could alone.